Moin, ihr wunderbare Menschen des Interwebs. Ich begrüße euch ganz herzlich zurück zu meinem Let's Play von The Great Ace-Attorney Chronicles. Wir wollten heute einmal entweder versuchen mit Kazuma zu reden oder mit Mr. Vigil reden. Ich versuche es jetzt einfach mal mit dem Krankenbett zuerst. Okay, hier hat sich jetzt was getan. This is the ward where Mr. Vigil was brought, apparently. To be frank, I'm a little worried about seeing him again. Ah, the lawyer. Hello again. Are you feeling better now, Mr. Vigil? Yes, thank you. Somewhat better. I am so sorry to have caused you to... I mean, it was because of me. If I hadn't exposed your secret and forced you to remember things you'd obviously try to forget. The prosecutor was here until a few moments ago too. You just missed him. Oh, Kazuma beat us to it. He said much the same as you. He was very apologetic. But the truth is, I brought all this upon myself. Please, don't think like that. Keeping it from Evie, my wife, all these years, I've carried such a sense of guilt. But that's not the worst of it. Over time, I obviously came to deceive myself as well. You mean about your dismissal? Looking back now, I'm beginning to think that perhaps Inspector Gregson didn't stumble across me by accident at all. I mean, he compensated me so generously for acting as his stand-in. He was clearly concerned for my well-being and doing what he could to help. So perhaps Gregson knew exactly what had become of Mr. Vigil all along then. I'm sure this is just deserts for 10 years of lies and deception, but... It wasn't me that helped the professor escape 10 years ago. It wasn't me. I swear it. I swear it's true. Oh, Mr. Vigil. I'm sure you'd rather not dredge up even more from your past at this time, but if possible, could you tell us exactly what really happened? I want to. I need to get all this off my chest. I just want someone to tell me what I should have done. Inspector Gregson was obviously engaged in a special operation of some sort. He was investigating something that even Scotland Yard couldn't know about. Details of the Reaper's marks, yes. It was when he had to carry out those investigations that I would take his identification and impersonate him. You'd pretend to be the inspector and carry out investigations on his behalf. Oh no, never! A common street peddler couldn't possibly carry out a proper police investigation. All I would do is go to the specified location and make a little hoo-ha. Just something to leave an impression, so everyone there would think a detective called Gregson was here. So that's what you were doing on the day prior to the incident? Yes, he asked me to make an appearance at the park on Lime Street for the Red-Headed League event. So as usual, I flashed the inspector's identification around and was very vocal about my presence. But then you were taken prisoner by those red-headed fraudsters. So, you would always make a point of showing Gregson's identification and generally being loud? That's what the inspector asked me to do, yes. Well, that's one way of becoming a legendary detective, I suppose. Not a good one, though. And as you know, I suffered this bruising around my neck at their hands, but the following day they kept their word and released me. Without returning the inspector's identification to you, however. We had arranged to meet in the Fresno Street room at 5 that day, so I could report back to the inspector. But at the agreed time, that's when I heard the gunshot. It was at midnight on 7th June, 10 years ago. That was the time scheduled for the execution. But the professor's execution never actually took place, did it? Or rather, the execution itself must have been used to effect a plan of escape. I hardly dare to imagine what a chilling plan it was. Berkeley was renowned for being the highest security prison in the country. Everything that went in or out of the place was searched multiple times. But there was one notable exception, or rather, one notable loophole, something that was never questioned. I have a feeling I know what that loophole was now. The coffins into which the bodies of the executed convicts were placed, correct? Yes. Once the coroner had confirmed the death of a condemned convict, the body was taken in its coffin for immediate burial in Lowgate Cemetery, just behind the prison. The chief warder first had to sign the necessary papers. And after that, no member of staff was permitted to touch the coffin containing the body again. When executions took place, only the executioner and the coroner were permitted inside the chamber. I would wait in the adjacent room for word that the condemned convict was dead. On that occasion, once I had that confirmation, I went into the mortuary to find a lone coffin as usual. The procedure was that I would sign the paperwork, having checked the coffin, then nail it shut. But for some reason that day, the coffin was already nailed shut. I didn't think anything of it at the time. I assumed that my deputy must have checked the coffin and nailed it shut before I arrived. So, you mean the coffin contained... Yes, I can only imagine that Asogi, having escaped his execution somehow, was alive inside the coffin. It was then taken out through the main gates and deposited in Lowgate Cemetery. Presumably there wouldn't have been enough air inside to breathe for long. So in the early hours following the burial, somebody dug up the coffin again to set Genshin free. But in the end, he was fatally shot in the graveyard anyway. What on earth really happened in Lowgate Cemetery that night, I wonder? I'm afraid I really don't know. All I can say with certainty are two things. Asogi couldn't possibly have escaped that way without help from somebody working in the prison. And that somebody was not me. Obviously, you knew the man then. The professor, I mean, Genshin Asogi. Yes, I remember him well, in fact. Would you mind telling us what you know? Well, having been condemned to death as he was, any contact I had with the man was short, obviously. After the trial, which was carried out behind closed doors, attended only by elite members of the judiciary, they called for his execution to be carried out at the earliest possible opportunity. The outcome of the trial was set from the beginning, wasn't it? It was a time of delicate diplomacy, but when Britain and Japan were in the process of signing an important treaty. That meant that this potentially destabilizing case had to be dealt with swiftly and discreetly. The man had less than a week in total. As I was the chief warder, I oversaw his short stay in the cells until his final hour. I remember being struck deeply by his noble character and incredible resilience. What do you mean exactly? He was a killer of many men, but he was always quiet and polite. He was a gentleman and a man of intellect. In fact, I couldn't bring myself to believe what he'd done, so I asked him one day. Those 5 members of the aristocracy whose lives were taken, were you really responsible? I'm guilty of the unforgivable crime of ending another human's life, yes. Das klingt aber eher so, als wäre er nur verantwortlich für einen Tod. Und ich habe das Gefühl, dass er damit den Bruder von Van Zieks meint. Ich kann mir vorstellen, ich könnte mir auch eigentlich vorstellen, dass Genshin versucht hat, Clint zu beschützen und gescheitert ist und deswegen Clint tot ist. Ich möchte mir immer noch nicht vorstellen, dass Genshin Asogi wirklich dieser Massenmörder ist. Ich möchte mir immer noch dieses im Hinterkopf offen halten, dass er eventuell unschuldig war und jemand anderes der eigentliche Professor ist. und dieser Professor jetzt einfach zum Reaper wurde. Also so könnte ich mir das jetzt, so könnte ich mir das irgendwie vorstellen. Aber das ist halt eine Theorie, ich habe absolut gar keine Beweise für das alles. Also keine Ahnung, ob das wirklich stimmt oder nicht. Wie realistisch das ist oder nicht, keine Ahnung. The following day the closed trial took place and the verdict was no surprise. Guilty. That night, when he was brought back to his cell, I saw something. Something unusual. Something unusual? What? The last will and testament of Genshin Isogi. As I said, it was on the night following his trial, after he'd been found guilty. I was doing the rounds of the cells, and when I looked into Isogi's, I noticed that he seemed to have a sheet of paper in his hand. His last will and testament, then, presumably. As soon as he noticed me, he hurriedly shoved it behind his back. But why did you find that so unusual? Isn't it normal for a man to pen a will when he knows his death is nigh? Yes, that's true, but there were special conditions to Isogi's incarceration, you see. What sort of conditions? Well, even though he was held in a cell designed for condemned inmates, he was allowed to keep his personal effects with him, with one exception. Really? He was allowed his things? That is unusual, certainly. Of course, he'd been convicted of killing 5 members of the aristocracy, but at the same time, he was a guest in our country from the Empire of Japan. The powers that be were determined that his final days shouldn't be needlessly uncomfortable. And what was the exception you mentioned? To the personal effects he was allowed? That's the point. He wasn't permitted to have writing materials. Specifically, no pens or paper. So he was prevented from leaving any written record of what had happened to him? Yes, that was the long and the short of it. I have no idea where he obtained that paper. Any writing materials would have been confiscated from him upon his incarceration. As I said, he hid the paper behind his back and then he pleaded with me. What did you just hide behind your back? Please. Please turn a blind eye. This is my lifeline. But you know it's against the rules. You're the only person who's seen. If you just agree to keep quiet. Alright then, but what's on that paper? A last will and testament. This will is the only weapon I have left now. How can a will be a weapon? So I decided to pretend I'd seen nothing, and I let him keep his will. But then later, it just seemed to vanish without trace. What do you mean it vanished? Jetzt frage ich mich natürlich, ob er eventuell diese Liste geschrieben hat mit den Namen. Aber ich meine, Asogi stand ja auch auf der Liste. Also weiß ich jetzt auch wieder nicht, das wäre auch... Yeah. It would seem that is in the end of the story of this mysterious will. I was the only person who saw Asogi's will, but somehow it disappeared. It was after Asogi's execution. Which was actually an elaborate jailbreak. The warders gathered up Asogi's possessions that were in his cell. They were all to be sent back to his family home in Japan, you see. To poor Kazuma-sama. And you're saying that it wasn't anywhere to be found among his personal effects? The will, I mean. That's right, though I didn't search through them myself. But Governor Caden was livid. He was screaming. It can't have disappeared completely. That doesn't quite make sense, though, does it? In what way? Well, we'd understood that only Mr. Wajil was aware of the will's existence, in which case, how did the prison governor know to look for it? Oh yes, you're right. I really don't know how he knew, but it certainly seemed as though he knew of the will's existence from the outset, only he didn't refer to it as a will. What he said was... The Asogi Papers. The Asogi Papers? I really can't tell you anything of the subsequent events. Because, well, of what happened. Your dismissal, and the way you blocked it all from your memory. I'd forgotten all this until today. I don't suppose it's relevant to the case, though. Well, anyway, thank you very much for sharing it with us, Mr. Bajil. We are very grateful. I'm afraid there's really little more I can tell you. My wife Evie will be here shortly, so I do hope I don't appear rude, but... No, not at all. Thank you again. But what will become of you now? Well, impersonating a police officer is a criminal offense, of course. I imagine that once I'm fully recovered, I shall be arrested. I am so sorry. Don't be, please. This was all my own doing. I always knew that this day would come. Well, I wish you well. Goodbye, Mr. Vigil. Before you go, there's just one thing. Yes? What is it? The Asogi Papers. I'd be very grateful if you would make no mention of the things I told you about them. Presumably for some good reason. It's my understanding that their very existence is a closely guarded secret. If it became known that I'd remembered... well... it could be rather troublesome, I think. I understand. Some sort of will that Genshin Asogi penned just before his death, which the man himself claimed was his last weapon. I wonder... perhaps it had something to do with his plan to escape. If there's anyone who might know more about the document that Kazuma's father left behind, it would be Mr. Vigil's governor. Then we know precisely where we must go. Back to Barclay Prison. Okay, Barclay Prison ist unser nächstes Ziel. Da werden wir auch hingehen. Allerdings erst im nächsten Part. Wie immer bedanke ich mich ganz herzlich fürs Zusehen. Hoffe, ihr hattet Spaß. Und wenn ihr mögt, sehen wir uns sehr, sehr gerne im nächsten Part wieder. Bis dahin. Ciao.